It was 5:52 p.m. on the Aurora skyscraper helipad. A harsh wind and a deep, threatening storm approached. Daniel Carter, a 36-year-old single father and technician, was wrapping up his inspection. Below, CEO Victoria Hale, 32, impeccably dressed in a white power suit, fumed. Her state-of-the-art helicopter refused to start. Victoria summoned Daniel. "A billion-dollar building, and they hire cheap labor like you." She folded her arms. "Fix it now, or don't show your face here again." Daniel found a fatal flaw. He stated clearly, "If you attempt to fly, it will crash." Victoria sneered. "What do you, a technician, know?" Daniel met her gaze. "I've started bigger ones. By hand." Victoria Hale crossed her arms tighter, the gesture one of absolute derision. A smirk played on her lips. "Are you a maintenance technician, Mr. Carter, or an action movie storyteller?" Her assistant, Mark, stood rigidly beside her, forcing a weak chuckle. Daniel ignored both, his focus fixed solely on the complex mechanical assembly. The wind roared, pulling at his worn utility jacket, but he remained rock steady. He used a small handheld light to examine the corroded wiring and the scorched secondary battery pack, tracing the path of the systemic failure. Victoria grew violently impatient. She tapped her designer heel sharply on the cold metal decking, the sound like a gunshot in the rising wind. "How long will this charade take, Carter?" she demanded, her voice a whip crack. Daniel did not look up, treating the billionaire CEO like a troublesome piece of equipment. He calculated the true depth of the issue, the damage extending far beyond the battery. "The failure is multi-layered. I need 30 minutes minimum to diagnose the complete system failure, bypass the primary electronic lockout, and stabilize the backup power circuit." Victoria snatched the satellite phone from Mark's hand. She glared at Daniel, her eyes blazing with irritation. "30 minutes is unacceptable. My meeting in Austin starts in 40. I have 10 minutes. I do not wait for hourly staff." Daniel finally paused, straightened up, and turned, his brow furrowed with genuine professional concern. "Ms. Hale, you don't understand the severity of this. The main rotor clutch is completely seized due to a lack of lubrication and thermal stress. The auxiliary electrical system is dead. If you force the startup sequence, the resulting pressure differential in the transmission will cause a catastrophic explosion or a structural failure upon lift." Victoria let out a cold, sharp, dismissive laugh. "Thank you for your irrelevant, catastrophic advice, Mr. Carter. Your job is to make the machine work, not to dictate my schedule or my physics." A junior staff member, waiting nervously for the CEO's imminent departure, leaned in and whispered, "Victoria is impossible. She trusts nobody but herself, especially not a man who has to work past 6 o'clock." Daniel felt the heat of her public humiliation, but his singular motivation was preventing a disaster. He knew the structural fault could not be solved by a quick fix. Victoria, sensing the silent judgment from her crew, raised her voice deliberately so everyone on the helipad could hear her final, cutting decree. "I don't trust a single father who works maintenance to lecture me on safety protocols or the value of my time. Your priorities are fundamentally different from mine." The barb was a sharp personal attack. Daniel simply inhaled deeply, steadily. He offered no verbal reaction, only a quiet resilience that infuriated her further. Just then, his old phone buzzed urgently. It was a video call from his daughter Lily, home alone and worried about the storm. Daniel answered immediately, turning away slightly. The moment he saw Lily's bright, anxious face, the warmest, most genuine smile of his entire day bloomed across his face. He spoke to her in soft, reassuring tones, explaining gently that the wind was loud, but he would be home soon. Victoria glanced over, catching the sight of his tender smile and the casual intimacy of the exchange. She felt a sharp, unfamiliar pang of annoyance seeing him look so happy, so complete, even after her brutal dressing down. When the call ended, Daniel lowered his phone, his serious, determined expression returning. He addressed Victoria one last time, his voice low, filled with urgency and deep concern. "I have to get home to my daughter, Ms. Hale. Please, for the sake of your life, do not fly this machine tonight. It is compromised." Victoria's response was ice cold and final. As I told you, Mr. Carter, you are not in a position to give me orders, advice, or ultimatums. The confrontation marked the end of Act 1. As if on cue, the pilot, visibly pale, announced over the comm system that the storm warning had been upgraded to a severe category, and all non-essential air traffic in a 100-mile radius was being immediately suspended. Victoria became even more furious, her impatience escalating to an alarming, dangerous degree. Daniel exhaled a long, heavy sigh. His gut instinct, honed by years of working around high-risk machinery, told him that something truly terrible was about to happen. He knew he could not leave. A fierce, shuddering gust of wind slammed into the helicopter with the force of a battering ram, causing the heavy machine to rock violently. The metal groaned audibly. The pilot, visibly nervous, quickly advised Victoria again. "Ma'am, I strongly recommend we retreat inside to the emergency shelter and wait for this squall line to pass. This is escalating rapidly." Victoria glared out at the darkening, churning sky, her features rigid with misplaced control. "No, my schedule is non-negotiable. I have a 6:30 acquisition meeting in Austin. I must fly." Her pride overruled practical reality and basic safety. Daniel immediately stepped in, his voice firm and desperate. "If you attempt takeoff now, the seized rotor will not withstand the dynamic forces. It will shear off the main drive shaft. You could die on impact within seconds of lifting off the pad." Victoria let out another brittle, mocking laugh, radiating scorn. "I don't die that easily, Mr. Carter, and your melodrama is getting exhausting. You worry too much about things you can't control." Daniel's voice hardened, carrying an undeniable authority that silenced even the wind for a moment. "I have seen a helicopter crash, Ms. Hale. I have pulled bodies out of the wreckage. I know what the consequences of this kind of recklessness look like." Victoria paused for a fleeting second, catching the raw, genuine pain in his eyes, a statement of witnessed horror. A sliver of uncertainty crossed her face, instantly masked by her typical arrogance. She remained frigid. "My maintenance failure is your job, technician. I pay you to solve problems, not to provide historical anecdotes." Daniel looked up from the engine bay, his face smudged with oil but his gaze clear and steady. "I am not here to clean up a mess, Ms. Hale. I am here to save lives. It's a fundamental difference you fail to comprehend." Her assistant, Mark, snorted, suppressing a louder burst of nervous laughter. "Save who? Save yourself the trouble, buddy. She's the CEO. She doesn't need your heroic grandstanding." Daniel ignored the assistant entirely. He looked up at the pitch-black sky, illuminated only by the tower's warning lights and the dramatic flashes of lightning. "The technical situation is this. If the auxiliary power system fails completely, the main flight computer will initiate its automatic security lockdown, preventing any ignition attempt. Even if the battery holds, you would be attempting an illegal, unpermitted flight in a restricted zone under a severe weather advisory." The pilot, who had been secretly running diagnostics, reluctantly nodded, confirming Daniel's technical assessment. "He's right, ma'am. That system is critical for both pre-flight checks and emergency stabilization. We are already beyond safe operating parameters." Victoria's face was a study in pure fury. Her schedule, her sense of corporate control, all were being dismantled by a common maintenance worker. "Fine, then fix it. Fix it faster than humanly possible. I want that rotor turning in 5 minutes. Daniel ignored the impossible demand. He quickly detached the charged secondary battery unit. The casing was so hot from the thermal malfunction that when he touched it, he recoiled violently, barely suppressing a sharp hiss of pain. The skin on his palm was instantly blistered. Victoria saw the immediate reaction, saw him wince and clutch his hand, but she deliberately looked away, feigning utter indifference. Acknowledging his pain would mean acknowledging his sacrifice and his humanity. Daniel controlled his breathing. He addressed the pilot again, his tone shifting decisively to one of calm, professional command. "Give me the manual starting crank, the heavy-duty one, and the lockout fluid." The pilot was stunned into petrified silence. "You mean manually crank the rotor assembly? With human, brute force? In this raging storm? That takes 5 men and perfect conditions." Daniel nodded without hesitation. If we don't manually restart the conditioning system, re-lubricate the clutch, and cycle the fuel pump immediately, the entire machine will seize and freeze solid within 20 minutes due to the extreme cold and moisture. It will be grounded permanently. Victoria finally started to feel a profound, cold anxiety creeping in. The reality of the danger was sinking past her defenses. She was trapped, and her life depended on the man she had just insulted. Daniel spoke softly, looking straight at her, his voice imbued with the simple wisdom of a man who cherished the life he fought to keep. If you had a child waiting for you, Mrs. Hale, if you had anyone whose entire future depended on your safe return, you wouldn't be taking this risk. Victoria snapped back immediately, her defense mechanism firing hard and fast. I do not need a man to lecture me on my personal choices or my responsibilities. Daniel held her gaze, refusing to back down, but his intensity softened slightly. This time, he didn't see the CEO. He saw only the deep, undeniable shadow of loneliness and grief in her sharp, cold eyes. A profound isolation. He saw himself years ago, before Lily. The defining pivotal moment of Act 2 came as Daniel made one final, gentle and utterly selfless observation that stripped away her armor completely. Nobody deserves to be strong or to face a terrifying crisis all by themselves, Victoria. The storm descended upon the helipad with savage, unrelenting speed. The wind roared, a violent entity that slammed into the skyscraper's rooftop, making the entire massive platform groan. Daniel, wasting no time, secured a thick, specialized safety harness tightly around his chest, doubling the carabiner clips. He moved with the practiced efficiency of a soldier, securing the lines to the nearest safety anchor before stepping decisively onto the narrow, icy rotor base. He knew the wind was his enemy, but the clock was worse. Victoria screamed at him over the deafening sound of the gale. Are you utterly insane, Carter? That wind is a Category 3 force. It could tear you right off the roof. Daniel shouted his reply back, his voice strained but steady. It's still better than letting you risk your life trying to fly a compromised machine. The staff below, watching through the reinforced windows, gasped, witnessing the life or death drama. Daniel was now perched precariously on the machine's chassis, his body leaning heavily into the punishing wind, his harness ropes tight. He shouted a command to the pilot. Pilot, apply the hydraulic brake lightly. Hold the main rotor blade steady. I need to crank the drive shaft. Daniel found the manual crank slot. He gripped the heavy drive shaft stub with his bare, oily, and now blistered hands. The wind hammered against the massive composite blades, pushing back with immense, painful force. The entire helicopter groaned under the agonizing strain. Mark, the assistant, still safe within the enclosed terminal, scoffed bitterly. The cheap technician thinks he's a cinematic hero. Look at him struggle. This is ridiculous. Victoria, watching Daniel's face contort with effort, snapped. She spun around, her face twisted in a terrifying mix of fear and visceral rage at Mark's callousness, and she screamed, Shut up! He is risking his life, you coward! The outburst shocked Mark into instant silence. The freeze moment. Daniel worked the drive shaft, manually lubricating the seized clutch. He put every ounce of his considerable physical strength and sheer military will into the effort. His muscles screamed against the force of the wind and the seized mechanism. The metal was resisting. Daniel gave a final, agonizing, lung-busting heave, pouring his absolute focus into the last, critical turn of the shaft. He screamed his last desperate command to the pilot over the noise. Fluid injection is complete. Activate auxiliary power system now. With a sudden, violent thunk, a noise of metal overriding resistance, and a simultaneous rush of mechanical sound, the rotor assembly unexpectedly surged to life. The blades began to turn slowly, then faster, cutting the air with a deafening, thunderous roar. Everyone, Victoria, the pilot, Mark, and the staff below, was paralyzed, their eyes wide with disbelief. The pilot shrieked over the now working comm system. He did it! He actually started the helicopter by hand. He cranked the entire drive system back to life. Victoria stood rooted to the spot, a statue of shock and utter shame. The man she had just viciously insulted had performed an impossible feat, saving her machine and preventing her possible death. Her humiliation was absolute, but in that exact moment of triumph, a terrifying shriek of tearing metal ripped through the air, louder than the rotor blades. The ground beneath them shook violently as the tower absorbed a massive impact. A massive sheet of reinforced metal signage, torn free from an adjacent, lower building by the gale's monstrous force, hurtled through the air like a guided missile, aimed directly at the stationary, paralyzed Victoria. Daniel, already hyper-alert from the adrenaline rush, saw the deadly projectile seconds before impact. He vaulted off the rotor base in a flash of superhuman speed. He lunged forward, slamming his heavy shoulder into Victoria, knocking her violently out of the path of the flying debris. The sheet of metal crashed down precisely where Victoria had been standing a heartbeat earlier, embedding itself deep into the thick metal of the helipad with a final, destructive crunch. Victoria tumbled hard into Daniel's powerful embrace, landing awkwardly. Her ears rang, the smell of ozone and burnt metal stinging her nostrils. She looked down at the sharp, twisted edges of the sign that had nearly decapitated her. Her pristine white suit was torn and stained with dirt from the landing pad. She felt Daniel's strong, steady heartbeat against her cheek. This wasn't just adrenaline. It was the raw reality of being held by a man who chose to protect her over himself. The moment felt more real than any quarterly report or acquisition contract. She pushed herself back slightly, looking at him, disbelieving. Her voice was a choked whisper. Why? Why did you save me? I treated you terribly. You should have let me be hit. Daniel's answer was immediate, honest, and drawn from a deeper principle. Because my daughter needs me alive. And you are worth saving, Victoria, just like anyone else in the city. Every life has value. Victoria crumpled finally. The ruthless facade shattered completely. A torrent of silent, cleansing tears streamed down her face. The pilot, recovering from the near-death experience, stared at Daniel. His eyes narrowed in recognition. Wait a minute. Carter, I know that story. Are you Staff Sergeant Daniel Carter of the 22nd Airlift Unit? The special operations mechanic? The junior employee gasped, clutching his phone where he had quickly Googled the name. That's Rotor Hands, the legendary mechanic who manually started a heavy-lift Chinook helicopter under direct enemy fire in Afghanistan? The one who got the Silver Star? Victoria's eyes widened. You were in the military? You're a decorated hero? Daniel sighed heavily, the energy draining from his frame. I was. I left the service after my wife passed away in a civilian accident. I just wanted to be a simple father to my daughter, Lily. This job lets me keep stable hours. The pilot, now filled with deep professional respect, confirmed the gravity of Daniel's achievement. Ma'am, if it wasn't for Staff Sergeant Carter, no one in this city could have started this machine in that state and in this weather. Victoria slowly stood up, brushing the dirt from her ruined white suit. She looked at Daniel with a gaze that was completely transformed. The act closed with Victoria's soft, genuine admission, a difficult apology tearing its way from her chest. Daniel, I am truly, deeply sorry for everything I said to you. The emergency services finally arrived, securing the damaged helipad and directing the crew to evacuate into the tower's penthouse lounge. Victoria was still trembling from the shock of Daniel's selfless, self-sacrificing act. She felt the weight of her own cruelty and his subsequent heroism crushing her past defenses. She sat huddled in a corner, her hands covering her face, her CEO composure completely gone. Daniel, after quickly assisting the pilot with the final emergency shutdown protocols, approached her. He held out a sealed bottle of cold water and a small, sterile dressing for the burn on his hand. Are you all right, Ms. Hale? Victoria swallowed hard, struggling to regain control of her voice. I have never been so terrified, Daniel. That sign, you saved my life twice in 10 minutes. Why? Daniel sat down a respectful distance away. He unwrapped the dressing slowly. The why doesn't matter in the moment, Victoria. It just needed doing. She made a raw, painful confession. I always project strength to everyone. I was taught that weakness is failure. But out there, when I saw that medal coming, I genuinely thought I was going to die alone." Daniel looked at her, his gaze unwavering and profoundly compassionate. "That feeling, the fear, that's human, Victoria. Being strong doesn't mean being alone. It means knowing who you can trust to catch you." At that simple, profound truth, Victoria broke completely. She wept openly, no longer caring about the image of the ruthless, untouchable CEO. She buried her face in her hands, the sobs racking her body, raw and unrestrained. The silence of the luxurious penthouse lounge, usually a symbol of her achievement, now felt like a vast, empty witness to her failure as a person. "I thought money and success were a shield," she whispered, her voice choked. "I thought being ruthless meant being safe. But out there, when I was on that cold ground, the only person who cared wasn't my assistant, wasn't my board, but the man I had scorned. I have nothing, Daniel. I have titles, assets, but I have no one." The confession hung in the air, heavy with years of suppressed emotion. She spoke in a small, broken voice. "No one has ever protected me like that. Not ever. Everyone I know wants something from me." Daniel offered a gentle, sad smile. "Perhaps that's because you built a wall so high, they genuinely thought you didn't need it. They assumed you were invulnerable." The comment struck her silent. She had built her fortress of success so high that no one believed she could be vulnerable. As the storm finally subsided and the emergency crews cleared the pad, Daniel informed her that he was leaving. Mark had already slipped away. Daniel stood up. "I should get home. Lily will be worried." Victoria looked up at him, her eyes still red. She felt a sudden, sharp dread at the thought of returning to her empty life. Daniel offered to take her home, his truck being the only working vehicle readily available. Victoria hesitated, her hesitation speaking volumes about her crippling loneliness, before giving a quiet, almost pleading nod. In Daniel's old, well-maintained but unglamorous pickup truck, the contrast with her world was stark. She looked over at his hands, the hands that had just saved her machine in her life. They were rough, calloused, scarred, and still stained with the grease earned from a lifetime of honest, essential work to raise his daughter. These hands held real, tangible value. As they pulled up to the foot of her colossal penthouse building, the silence was heavy, but no longer hostile. The defining, heartbreaking moment of Act 4 came when Victoria finally spoke, her voice quiet, stunned by her own utter vulnerability. "Daniel, if you hadn't been there, if you hadn't saved me, who would have known? Who would have even picked me up?" Daniel drove Victoria home to her colossal architectural penthouse, a place of breathtaking beauty, yet cold, echoing, and profoundly empty. "It's too big," she murmured, stepping across the flawless marble floor. "It feels like a cage. When you're by yourself." Daniel immediately understood that profound sense of isolation. The following day, Daniel had to collect Lily from school. Victoria, making an unexpected call, asked tentatively if she could accompany him. She didn't want to go back to the office, didn't want to be alone. Lily took an instant, joyous liking to the striking, well-dressed woman. "You're so pretty. Are you a real princess? You look like the Ice Queen from the movies." Victoria actually laughed, a rare, genuine, unforced sound that softened her entire face. "No, sweetie, I'm just a CEO. But maybe I'm learning not to be so cold." That evening, Victoria found herself seated awkwardly at Daniel's humble kitchen table, sharing a simple, warm meal with the single father and his daughter. She asked Lily, her voice tentative and soft, "What do you want for Christmas this year, sweetie?" Lily didn't hesitate for a moment. She looked right at Victoria. "I want you to have dinner with us again. You make Dad happy." Victoria looked at Daniel, utterly disarmed, her heart melting into a rush of warmth she hadn't felt since childhood. Later, after Lily had been tucked into bed, Victoria turned to Daniel, her eyes serious, raw. She finally spoke the deep, painful truth. "I'm scared, Daniel. If I get close to you and Lily, I'll break something good. I always destroy the things I care about most." Daniel reached out, gently covering her hand with his calloused one. "Victoria, you've spent your life building empires. You have courage. You won't break us. You saved me from a loneliness greater than you realize, simply by needing a ride home." She choked up, fighting back a fresh wave of tears. "Do you honestly think, after everything I've done, everything I've been, do you truly think I deserve to have someone like you? Or a family like this?" Daniel looked at her, his faith in her clear and simple. His answer was a soft, firm declaration of faith in her future, not her past. "I think you deserve a family, Victoria. And I think Lily deserves a role model who is brave enough to cry." Victoria cried again, but this time, the tears were those of overwhelming, unexpected joy and radical acceptance. The final scene found the three of them standing together before Daniel's cozy front door a month later. A gentle cinematic snow had begun to fall, dusting the street in white, a promise of Christmas. Victoria reached out and gently took Lily's small hand, then turned to Daniel. She spoke, her voice laced with hope and committed intention. "I've canceled my Austin travel for the holiday. I'd like to be here with you two, if you and your dad still want me." Lily wrapped her arms around Victoria in a fierce, immediate hug. Daniel responded, his heart visible in his face, with the warmest, most genuine smile of his entire life. "We want you, Victoria, today and every day, very much. If you believe stories like this, about finding family where you least expect it, deserve to be told, leave a comment and subscribe to Single Dad Stories.